Let's play a quick game. I'll say 10 woodworking terms and you let me know how many you actually understand. Now, no shame if you don't actually know them, but by the end of this video, you will know all of them. And even better than that, you'll know exactly how they'll help you be a better woodworker. Alright, so as we go through these, I'm also going to clear up some common misconceptions with these terms along the way. And we're going to start at the same place that most woodworkers start their woodworking journey, and that is dimensional lumber. Now, contrary to popular belief, dimensional lumber is not wood that exists outside of time and space. Dimensional lumber refers to wood that has been cut and processed to standard sizes, mostly for construction purposes. When you go to a big box store and you see those stacks of 2x4s, 2x6s, 1x8s, that's dimensional lumber. But here's where it gets a little bit tricky. The actual dimensions of 2x4s is not 2 inches by 4 inches. Yeah, I know, it's kind of dumb. But a 2x4 actually measures in at 1.5 inches by 3.5 inches. The 2x4 designation refers to the rough dimensions of the lumber before it's dried and planed smooth. This is important to know because when you're planning a project, you need to use the actual dimensions, not the nominal dimensions. So if you're building something that needs to fit a specific space, make sure you're calculating with the real measurements. Now, a lot of times when you go to buy dimensional lumber, you'll see it labeled SPF. Now, that's not because it can keep you from getting sunburn. That stands for spruce, pine, fir, which are the 3 kinds of softwoods that dimensional lumber is typically made from. For most beginner projects, you'll probably be working with dimensional lumber because it's readily available and relatively inexpensive. At least that's what I started with. Now, staying on the topic of lumber, our next term, which can be confusing to a lot of people, is board feet. What it isn't is a couple of feet with nothing to do. What it is a unit of volume for measuring lumber. 1 board foot equals a piece of wood that is 1 foot long, 1 foot wide, and 1 inch thick. It's basically 144 cubic inches of wood. Why is this important? Because hardwood is typically sold by the board foot, not the linear foot like dimensional lumber. If you're buying walnut, maple, or oak for a project, you need to be able to calculate how many board feet you need. And calculating it is really easy, especially if you have a calculator handy. The formula is simply length in inches times width in inches times thickness in inches, all divided by 144. Understanding board feet helps you budget your projects more accurately when comparing prices between different suppliers. It's also helpful for estimating how much wood you'll get from a log if you ever dare to mill your own lumber. But remember, board feet is a measure of volume, and looks can be deceiving if you're trying to eyeball it. These boards have identical board feet, even though their appearance and dimensions are completely different. But don't worry about trying to eyeball it. As long as you have a tape measure and a calculator, you'll be good to go. Okay, so knowing board feet is super important for buying hardwood lumber, but probably more important is knowing these terms: cupping, bowing, and twisting. And I know what you're thinking. And no, these are not activities that you'll find in a Kama Sutra book. They're actually the main ways that you'll see that wood can warp and deform on you, mostly during the drying process. And the reason why it's important is because if a board is warped too severely, it can dramatically reduce the amount of usable wood you're left with after the milling process. Cupping occurs when a board curves across its width, with the edges higher or lower than the center, forming like a smiley face or a frown when you're looking at the board from the end grain. This often happens when one face of the board dries faster than the other. So are cup boards unusable? Not at all. If you're going to be ripping the cup board into thinner pieces before using it, you can avoid a good amount of the loss that you'd have if you milled the entire width of the cup board at once. Bowing is when a board curves along its length, like a bow or an arch. And while not ideal, this type of warping is not necessarily a death sentence either. If you're cross-cutting the board into smaller pieces before using it, you can effectively reduce the waste, similar to how ripping reduced the waste of the cup board. Twisting. Now this is the most severe form of warping, where the board literally twists like a propeller, with opposite corners lifting in different directions. This type of warping is to be avoided like the plague. It's a pain in the rump to mill, and once you get it milled flat, you end up losing a good amount of the stock just to get it to be usable, depending on how severe the twist was. But all is not lost if you have a twisted board. One of my favorite things to make with twisted lumber is s'mores. This next word can be kind of confusing to a lot of folks. confusion around what it actually is, why it's important, and that word is kerf. Now, kerf is not the sound your tires make when you drive your car like you're in one of those Vin Diesel movies. No, kerf is actually the width of the material that's removed when you make a cut on a board with a saw. Think about it. When you cut a piece of wood, the saw blade isn't just creating a magical line that separates the wood. It's actually removing material, creating a gap. That gap is the kerf. Why does it matter? Well, if you're making precise cuts, you need to account for the kerf. Let's say you have an 8-foot-long 2x4 that you need to cut into 4 equal length pieces, like I did when I was making my raised garden beds. 8 feet divided by 4 feet is 2 feet, or 24 inches. If I were to just set my stop block at 24 inches, what I'd end up with is 3 pieces that were 24 inches and one that is unusable at about 23 5/8 inches. But by setting my stop block at least 1/8 of an inch shy of 24 inches to account for the blade kerf, I get 4 equally sized pieces, thus eliminating frustration, waste, and saving money. The width of the kerf depends on your saw blade. Typically, a standard full kerf table saw blade has a kerf of about 1/8 of an inch. But thin kerf blades are also available that remove less material. Now that you know how much wood your blade eats up, let's talk about cutting in a whole different way. Resawing. Despite what you might gather from the name, this is not sawing something and then sawing it again. Well, I guess it kind of is, but in one very specific way. What I mean is that when you cut a board this way across its length, you're cross-cutting. When you cut a board this way across its width, you're ripping. Resawing is the process of cutting a board through its thickness to create thinner pieces. This technique is incredibly useful for several reasons. First, it allows you to create your own thin stock from thicker boards, which is important because oftentimes thinner material is not readily available for purchase. Second, it lets you book match pieces, creating mirror image grain patterns that can be visually stunning in your projects. Resawing is typically done on a bandsaw because it has a thin kerf, wasting less wood in the cutting process. It also has more capacity than using something like a table saw, which you can also resaw with, but you'll be limited by the height of your blade. I've used both methods, and I find the table saw to be a bit more precise if you have a smaller piece that you're resawing, but like I said, your size is limited, and I just find it to be a bit sketchier overall. This next word you may or may not know, but it does have a fun fact about it that a lot of people don't know. And that word is dado. And if you're thinking, isn't that prehistoric flightless bird? No, that's dodo. I'm talking about dado. A dado is a groove cut across the grain of a piece of wood. It's basically a rectangular channel that another piece of wood can fit into. Think of it like cutting a trench across a board. Dados are incredibly useful for joining pieces of wood together, especially in cabinetry and shelving. For example, in this shelf I made, I cut dados into the legs to support the shelves. This created a much stronger joint than just attaching the shelves with nails or screws. You can create dados using a table saw with a dado stack, a router, or even multiple passes of a regular saw blade. Oh, and that fun fact that I mentioned earlier? Technically, it's only a dado if you cut across the grain. If you cut the same kind of groove, but it runs with the grain, that's actually called a groove. But if you call them all dados, I won't tell anybody. That's what I do. Our next term is one word with 2 different pronunciations, and that's rabbet or rebate. Not to be confused with rabbit or rebate. The difference in pronunciation is basically regional. English speakers in North America are usually going to say rabbit, while those in Europe and Australia and what have you will typically go with rebate. A rabbet is a recess or groove cut into the edge of a piece of wood. It's like a dado, but instead of being cut into the face of a board, it's cut along the edge. This creates an L-shaped notch. Rabbets have a number of uses. Some include cabinet backs, creating decorative reveals, or creating lap joints. Just like a dado, you can create a rabbet using a table saw or a router. And when using a router, you can use a rabbeting bit, which is basically a straight bit with a bearing on it, or you can use a straight bit with an edge guide or a straight edge. Alternatively, you can even use a rabbet plane, if you're into hand tools. while rabbet is actually one word with two different pronunciations. This next term is actually two words with one pronunciation: mortise and tenon. And even though mortise and tenon may sound like the personal injury lawyer you call if you've been hurt in a car accident, that is in fact not what it is. Mortise and tenon is actually one of the oldest and strongest woodworking joints around. It consists of two parts: the mortise, which is a cavity cut into a piece of wood, and the tenon, which is a projection on another piece of wood that fits precisely into the mortise. It's your classic male-female connection. Mortise and tenon joints are incredibly strong because they have a lot of glue surface and they prevent the pieces from twisting or pulling apart. They're commonly used in furniture making, especially for chairs and table legs, doors, and frames. Now there's another version of this joint that uses what's called a loose tenon. This increases the efficiency of this joinery method. Instead of carving the tenon directly from one of your work pieces, you create matching mortises in both pieces and insert a separate piece of wood as the tenon. This approach gives you all the strength benefits of traditional mortise and tenon joints, but can be much faster to execute. The most well-known tool for this is the domino, which is essentially a specialized mortising machine that creates perfectly matched mortises in both workpieces. While the domino makes this process incredibly quick and accurate, you can also create loose tenon joints with a router, a drill press, or even hand tools, if you're patient. While mortise and tenon joints connect two separate pieces of wood, sometimes you need to create a larger or stronger piece from multiple smaller ones. And that's where our next word, lamination, comes in. And if you're confused because you thought lamination meant covering something in thin, tight plastic, well, I guess you're right, but not in woodworking. In woodworking, lamination is the process of gluing multiple pieces of wood together to form a thicker, stronger, or more stable part. It's not just for looks. Laminated wood can be more resistant to warping and cracking than single solid boards, especially when the boards are oriented with the grain running in the same direction. You'll often see this method in butcher block countertops, workbench tops, and curved parts like chair backs, especially when bending thin strips around a form. But don't confuse that type of lamination with the type used when making plywood. That's a different kind of engineered lamination where the grain alternates for stability. In everyday woodworking, lamination gives you control, flexibility, and strength. Plus, it's a good way to use up all those offcuts you were otherwise going to throw out. This next word is one of the first words I learned in my woodworking journey. Probably because a lot of my first projects were outdoor builds using a lot of dimensional lumber and screws. And that word is countersink. And again, despite what the name might imply, it has nothing to do with either a counter or a sink. A countersink is a cone-shaped hole that allows the head of a screw to sit flush with or below the surface of your workpiece. It's what prevents those screw heads from sticking out and snagging your clothes or scratching your skin. And in addition to those practical advantages, it just looks better and feels better too. To create a countersink, you typically use a special drill bit called a countersink bit. These bits have both a screw shaft to make a pilot hole and a cone-shaped cutter that creates the depression for the screw head. Countersinking is not just for outdoor projects though. It's valuable for any project where you're going to have exposed screws. And if you want to know about the different types of countersink bits that you should be using, along with about 7 other drill bits that every woodworker needs, check out this video right here. All right? Y'all take it easy.